Hi, this is John. I'd like to talk to you today about preparing for what we think might be an El Nino season. There's been a lot of talk about El Nino coming, and that usually means, to some extent, drought or droughty year. So, what do we do to prepare for such a scenario? I'd like to begin that by saying, in Zimbabwe here, we need to always be prepared for drought. It's a very common thing for Zimbabwe to be dry somewhere every year. I mean, we do have these 5 regions, from region 1 up in the eastern highlands, which is very wet, down to region 5, which is very dry, mostly in the low-veld parts of the country. So across the board, every year, there is some portion of the country that is dry or doesn't receive a significant amount of rainfall for good cropping. But even in a good year, there are portions or places in the country, in the high rainfall areas, that can be dry for short periods of time. And so we are used to drought in Zimbabwe. It's not an uncommon thing. And if you anything like my age or have looked at records going back 100 years or so, our rainfall in Zimbabwe is highly variable. We can go in places like Harare, where you'd expect an average rainfall of 800 something millimeters. It can range from 400 to 1200 millimeters. And some years it'll be low, some years it'll be high. And the distribution of that rainfall is also not always perfect. Even if you get 800 millimeters, like this last season, we had great rainfall in January and February, and then a very dry March and April. Even though some people around, for example, Chinoy, recorded some of the highest rainfalls they've ever had in January. So in Zimbabwe, we have to be prepared for drought. So let's think about how we as farmers, crop farmers in particular, can prepare for drought. What can we do? How can we adjust or practice our farming in such a way that mitigates the risk of drought? Another thing I'd like to say before I get into some of the ways we can deal with drought is an overall general principle. We know that water is essential for life. And the only source of water that we have in dryland cropping and in the veld and so on is from the rain. And that rain then goes into the soil, and the plants abstract that water from the soil. So we have to be sure that every drop of rain that we receive remains in our land and can seep down into the soil and through the soil into our river systems or into the plants. As soon as we have significant amounts of runoff, we are losing that critical water that's needed for our farms, our plants, and the river systems. I think all of us have seen the rivers in the summer season that are just laden with silt and which are just for a few months flowing so abundantly, and then for the rest of the year there's a trickle. That used not to be the case. If you look at rivers today, okay, the big rivers still flow, but why do they flow in August? Where's that water coming from when we haven't had rain since February, March? That water is coming from the seepage that came or comes from the rain that was falling and going into the soil and down into the deep water resources underneath the soil and then seeping out into the river systems. I always remember a guy long back, Kevin Walters, who was the water bailiff and a farmer down in Shamba. He always used to say to me, or he did say to me, rivers accumulate water. Rivers, as you go down them, are accumulating water as they flow because this water seepage from the various tributaries and so on into the river. So we need to make sure as farmers that we capture as much rainfall into our fields as possible, into our soil as possible, and minimize the direct runoff from our fields. Of course, there will be some runoff that occurs because we will get storms sometimes that exceed the infiltration capacity of our soils. But we want to be able to have a soil that captures the majority of that rain and does not lose so much by runoff. And of course, if there's runoff, there's also erosion. And we don't want erosion in our soils. For every millimeter of soil that gets washed off, it might not be noticeable. It's only a millimeter, but it's tons and tons of soil plus nutrients that we are losing from our farms. So everything I'm going to say about the ways we can deal with drought, with a possible El Nino, is with this in mind, that we capture the rainfall that we receive into our soils. So the first thing I think related to that then is we need to maintain as much residue cover on our soils as possible. At this time of year, August, there have been fires around. I know some fields have been laid bare because of fires. So we need to control fires as much as possible. Then we need to maintain that residue by minimizing our tillage as much as possible. Driving out to the farm today, I saw a farmer disking. And I was thinking, why? He's kicking up dust, he's creating this bare soil. And for what purpose? Maybe he's going to grow tobacco, okay. And I'm no tobacco fan at all. But yeah, if we can maintain residues on the surface, residues minimize the impact of the rainfall. Residues also protect the soil from evaporation. So the water that goes into the soil is less likely to evaporate as it would do from a bare soil. Residues enable the water from the rain to infiltrate easily. Each little piece of residue acts like a little dam. So when there's a little bit of runoff, it goes up against a piece of residue and infiltrates into the soil. And then, of course, residues are going to provide that ideal microenvironment for the microbiology in our soils, whether that's bacteria, fungi, earthworms, other little insects and so on that are resident in our soils, which are vital for the health of our soils. So residues are really, really important. And if we can maintain as many and as much residues on our soils as possible, that is only a good thing to help mitigate drought. The second thing that I'd like to think about is minimizing tillage. So tillage is required to plant. Somehow you've got to get in there through those residues and plant. But if you can minimize that tillage by, on the one hand, going as far as zero tilling, if that's possible, but there are ways to plant like rip on row, zone tillage, even on a small scale, holing out with a budzer and planting. These will disturb the soil as little as possible. As soon as we disturb the soil in any significant way, we encourage oxidation of the organic matter that's there. We disrupt that soil structure. We disrupt the little channels in which water can flow into our soil. And so we want to minimize tillage. Now I know some soils might be compact. Either on the surface they might be compact, or at a deeper layer. If you've been disking or plowing regularly for many years, you might have a subsoil compaction problem. So ripping is one way to deal with compaction, and it may be necessary. But again, if you can maintain the residue in between those rip lines, that is ideal. So that's the second thing. Minimize your tillage as far as you can and find ways around disturbing the soil as little as possible. The third thing is choosing the right crops for your farm. We have a multitude of crops we can grow. We tend to think just of maize and soybeans in a typical row crop farming situation, but there are a multitude of crops that can be grown, and many of them are more drought tolerant than others. It's not that maize is not drought tolerant. It's more that it's susceptible to drought at particular times, especially around flowering. Similarly, soybeans are not necessarily susceptible to drought their whole life. In fact, their main susceptible period is in grain filling. the rest of the life cycle of the soybeans is fairly tolerant of drought. But there are crops like sorghum, sunflower, which are better at tolerating drought. And we need to be thinking about those. And then there's other crops which some farmers might be willing to look at: groundnuts, cotton, sesame, pigeon pea, Nimo, Nyamba, okay, beans. There's a whole range of crops that we can grow. And the more diversity we have on our farm, the more we can be resilient in the face of drought. Now, I know on a commercial scale, some of these crops do not have a good market, or some of them are not that easy to grow on a commercial scale because of particularly labor and harvesting requirements. But they are nonetheless crops to think about and find if there are markets for them, and if you can work around the management aspects of them. Creating that diversity on your farm will give you more ability to ride through a drought. So choose your crops wisely. Number 4 then is, within those crops, choose the varieties that are going to be suitable for your environment. Now, if you look at maize, a lot of seed companies will say that their maize is drought tolerant. That doesn't mean that those varieties are resistant to drought or can grow without water. It just means that they have a relatively better yield potential than a drought susceptible one. And they've been bred, for example, maize, that the synchrony between pollen shed and silk is very good. So the silks are not held back by the drought. They come out at the same time that the pollen is being shed. Or they don't leaf curl so much, and they have a better way of handling moisture loss. So these varieties, yeah, they are drought tolerant to some degree. Sometimes drought tolerance is related to the length of growing period. A very early maturing variety can escape drought, but a late maturing variety can also be drought tolerant, because a 2-week drought in a late maturing variety is a shorter proportion of its lifespan than a 2-week drought in an early maturing variety. I know of some late maturing varieties that are very drought tolerant, and it's worth even planting them. In soybeans, if you're going to grow a determinate variety, at flowering they're at more risk of drought than an indeterminate variety. So look at the varieties that are available and choose those which seem to have the best drought tolerance. But related to that, I think it's a very good idea to grow a number of varieties on your farm. So for example, if you're looking at maize, you can grow a late maturing variety with a medium maturing variety. And you can grow a medium maturing with an early maturing variety. And you can grow a very early variety with an early variety. So these could be planted in the same field, either as a mix of seed or in rows, say 4 rows of a late maturing, 4 rows of a medium maturing, and so on, so that you get that pollen spread and that diversity in your field. Same with soybeans. Grow 2 or 3 or 4 varieties and give yourself that diversity and that resilience that you need in the face of a drought. So those are 4 things which I think are useful for preparing for a drought. Retain residues, minimize tillage, choose the right crop combination with a diversity of crops, and choose a number of varieties within each crop so that you have a diversity of varieties, and if necessary even mix those varieties. Now number 5. What is number 5? This is simply to manage your fields in an optimum manner in the context of a drought. So let's start at fertilization. The fertilizer that you put on your soil is costing you money. And in the face of a drought, when you expect your yields to be lower, then you need to adjust your fertilizer program accordingly. You can always add more, especially nitrogen, if you feel that necessary. The rains are not as bad as they thought they were going to be. But in your planting operation, make sure that you are not over fertilizing. We tend to, in this country, I think, especially on a commercial scale, put too much potassium on. Our soils generally are rich in potassium. They're generally weak in phosphorus. But if you've been fertilizing your maize and wheat and even your soybeans regularly with large amounts of, say, a compound 6-23-23, you can this year scale back if you think that's possible. And I would encourage you to think more in terms of organics. There are a number of companies providing organic related fertilizers now. They're either a mixture of organic and inorganic fertilizers, or they are primarily organic fertilizers. Now, yeah, there's issues around application and so on, but the more organic matter you can put into your soil, the better it is for your crop and for water retention. So think about how you can incorporate more organics into your fertilizer program. Secondly, on planting. Generally speaking, you would want to plant at a slightly lower plant population in a drought year than you would under a normal or irrigated scenario. So look at your plant populations carefully, reduce them a little bit if necessary. Instead of planting 60,000 plants per hectare in maize, bring that down to 45,000 plants per hectare. Give each plant more access to water. And stagger your planting. Put your planting over a 3-4 week period so that you can give yourself that resilience. You don't know how this rainfall pattern is going to be. But make sure when you do plant, you plant under the most ideal conditions that you can. To get that crop off onto a good start is absolutely essential, so that the crop emerges quickly, the roots go down as deep as they can, and you establish that crop in good situation. So plant at a slightly lower population, plant over an extended period of time, 3-4 weeks, and make sure when you do plant, it's under the ideal conditions. Then, of course, managing your weeds, pests, diseases are also an integral part of management. But don't go overboard with pest and disease control. Yeah, we obviously have to control those things, but are those pests and are those diseases at a level that warrants spending money on them? So scouting and checking your fields to make sure that you are only spraying if it's absolutely necessary. And so you're not just spraying as a preventative, but you are spraying more in reaction to the season and how things are going. And then adjusting your in-season fertilizer program as you see the season developing. It's quite possible to top up if the season is better than what you expected, either through foliar applications, which can stimulate. So let's say you go into a 2-3 week drought and your crop is really struggling, and then you get a good rainfall event. It might be worth at that point to go in with a foliar to give that plant a good kick, a good opportunity to regrow and to ignite its photosynthetic capacity again and really boost its potential. And even with dry top dressings, you can go in with certain top dressings at certain times. My feeling on this is also to stay away from the chloride type fertilizers and move more towards the sulfate based fertilizers. So if you're going to put a top dressing on, look at ammonium sulfate. I know it's more expensive, but it is more efficient in terms of providing the plant that nitrogen and the sulfur that it needs. Avoid urea if you can, and go with ammonium nitrate. Much more quickly available to the maize plant. Think about gypsum. Gypsum as a side dressing. Calcium is essential to crops, and I think we tend to be a little bit shy on the amount of calcium that we're applying in our fields. So really, in-season fertilizer management practice can make a big difference to your crop. So optimize your management of your crop during the season to remember how to capture as much rainfall as possible. So there used to be, quite often in the old days, guys would do inter-row ripping to break up the soil and improve infiltration. They would do potholing to capture that rainfall. So those are things that might be useful to you to think about and to apply if necessary. Optimize your management from planting all the way through to harvest to make the best use of the rainfall that you get. So those are my few ways that you might think about to manage your fields in the light of a drought coming. Now, like I say, in Zimbabwe, every year, I think we need to think of as a drought year. So these are kind of principles that I think apply whatever your expectations are. So I hope those ideas are useful to you. I know many of you know these well already, but I would encourage you to apply them more and more, to think more and more along the lines of a biological farming system, being in tandem with nature rather than fighting against nature, to building up our soil health, because that's where the whole crop begins, is having a healthy soil. And a healthy soil is one which will capture the rainfall and will have the nutrients and will have that microenvironment that's best suited to your crop. So thanks for watching and happy farming, and I do hope that even if there is a drought, you have a successful year.